Hey, what's going on, everybody? Brent Hyden here, coming at you on this Monday morning. We have 9 games around the NBA to talk about, so let's just go ahead and hop in. Again, I'm going to skip over some of these games that are a little less appealing, and I'm going to focus on some of the more important ones that we need to talk about briefly, and of course, everything that I am giving you in this recording and all of my thoughts for all of the games are located in the Google Doc that you can download and read there. Uh, Detroit, Cleveland, there is some injury news to keep an eye on. Obviously, Nance, Thompson are out. Kevin Love is questionable, and Blake Griffin, there's a potential for him to rest in this game, so that's something that we need to definitely keep an eye on. But this game, as I mentioned in the notes, not terribly appealing. I'll dig into it just a little bit here in just a second, but Utah Washington is one that I definitely want to make sure that I have exposure to. 228.5 over under Washington or Utah 4-point favorites. New York at Toronto, lots of injury news to talk about in that one, so that's going to be a game that I'm going to be keeping an eye on and want to have some exposure to. Miami, Oklahoma City with Russell Westbrook suspended. We're going to get Paul George and Dennis Schroeder as the top options there, so I'll talk about that here in just a moment. Golden State San Antonio is definitely interesting. I don't find myself getting a ton of exposure there yet, but with injury news potentially changing that, we'll have to wait and see. New Orleans at Dallas is going to be a great game to target a 230.5 over under. That's a game that I have a ton of interest in. Chicago at Phoenix, another game that I have a ton of interest in. We'll get to that one here towards the end of the podcast. And Indiana at Portland, CJ McCollum is going to be out for this game, so that's going to open some things up that we definitely want to talk about. But let's just go ahead and hop into the first game, Detroit at Cleveland. As I mentioned, it's not a spot that I find myself having a ton of interest in. I do like Andre Drummond, Blake Griffin, Reggie Jackson, who is just really cheap across the industry. 5,100 on DraftKings, 5,600 over on FanDuel. Has been playing pretty well recently. As I outlined in the notes, over his last in 4 of his last 10 games, he's topped 30 fantasy points. He's averaged 1.07 fantasy points per minute with a 28.3% usage rate over the last 30 days. This is a spot where Reggie Jackson is someone that I definitely have a lot of interest in. It is a little concerning that he's not getting a ton of minutes. But he's producing, and he has 20 real points in back-to-back games. So he's someone that I have my eye on. Again, Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond, Luke Kennard, someone that I outlined in the notes as well, is a very interesting value option, but the status of Blake Griffin is something that we're definitely going to want to keep an eye on. It would probably move like Thon McCurr into value territory if Griffin misses this game. On the Cleveland side, I did highlight Kevin Love, Colin Sexton, and Ante Zizic as guys to look at here. Zizic, 4K on DraftKings, is obviously going to be in play as a value center option with Thompson and Nance already out. Zizic is 4,300 over on DraftKings. Production has not really been there, but the minutes are going to be pretty appealing. He's going to have to play a lot of minutes in this game against a Drummond, Blake Griffin, Zaza front court, so something to keep an eye on there. But let's dig into this Utah-Washington game, because that's the one that is very appealing. As I outlined in Discord already this morning, if you're crunching lineups using Fantasy Cruncher or any other site for that matter, I would set a rule to make sure that you have at least one player from the Utah side of this game. Again, a 228 over under. Utah 4-point favorites. Dante Exum is out. Thabo Sefolosha was out and then is upgraded to questionable. It doesn't really matter. Ricky Rubio, someone that I'm going to get to here in just a moment, just 4 of 27 from the floor in his 3 games since returning from his injury. That's 15% shooting. That's really, really bad. But this is a spot here against Washington that I really, really like him for a value price. He's just 5K over on DraftKings, 6K over on FanDuel. We know Washington really bad against opposing point guards. And he's still getting it done with the rebounds and the assists and the steals and things like that. In a fast-paced game, I expect his minutes to be up higher. These last couple games have been a little bit of blowout, things like that. I do expect him to shoot better than 15% from the floor, and 5K is just way too cheap for Ricky Rubio. I absolutely love him in this spot. I really, really like Derek Favors, Rudy Gobert, Donovan Mitchell as well. Guys that I did highlight pretty heavily in the notes. Derek Favors, 1.30 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. That has been he has been really, really good. Price tag is elevated, 5,800 on DraftKings, 6,800 on FanDuel, but for good reason. Over 35 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. Some of these even blowouts, and he's playing limited minutes, but the double-digit rebounds is appealing. This is a spot, Washington does have a lot of guys that do take a decent amount of shots at the paint or in the paint or at the rim. That definitely helps his block upside. And the fact that they're giving up just so many rebounds to opponents this season, 47.4 rebounds, 51.6 points in the paint, 14.3 second chance points. That bodes really well for Favors. That also bodes really well for Rudy Gobert. Obviously Washington 27th in defensive efficiency to opposing centers. I did note in the breakdown, the Wizards really, really bad against opposing power forwards. They're giving up 23.4 points, 11.8 rebounds per game, 50% shooting, and 40.6% three-point shooting. So definitely want to get some exposure to one of these guys. I lean Favors because of the price tag and the way that my lineup construction is probably gonna go tonight, but definitely have no issue with Rudy Gobert, who much like the Brooklyn game should have no issues putting up just a monster outing here tonight. So I do have interest in Rudy Gobert as well. On the Washington side, I'm not going to dig too deep during this recording about it, but I will say Bradley Beal, who's just been outstanding, 33.2 points on 52.2% shooting over his last 5 games. He is absolutely matchup proof. He scored below 40 fantasy points in just one of his last 20 games. That includes some really tough matchups. He did have a big game against the Grizzlies, big game against the Pacers, Raptors. Jazz struggling to defend the three-point line, allowing opponents to shoot 36.3% on above the break threes. They're giving up 0.93 points per possession in isolation, and this guy is just playing so many minutes. It's really tough to not look at him heavily. I know I wouldn't expect 50-plus fantasy points out of him in this spot, but the fact that he's playing that many minutes makes it really hard for him to not pay off his salary. So definitely someone to take a long look at here tonight. Looking at Denver-Boston, this is a game that I did go a little bit in depth in the notes. Obviously, Nikola Jokic, someone to heavily consider in this spot. It is worth noting. Gordon Hayward is doubtful for this game. Al Horford is probable. Robert Williams is questionable. I would still keep an eye on the news for Al Horford, who left the last game with a little bit of a knee injury. I would not be shocked to see him sitting out one of these next couple of games. So something to keep an eye on. Jokic, who is just absolutely matchup proof, is still interesting. 27% usage rate over the last 30 days, 84.3 touches per game, 1.50 fantasy points per minute. And that price tag is coming down, and that's really, really appealing. He has not been great recently, but we know the upside is there. And again, that price tag is just so cheap. It is a spot where I absolutely love getting some exposure to Nikola Jokic. Boston really struggling to defend the paint, mid-range, and rim recently, so that bodes really well for Jokic. Paul Millsap has been playing extremely well lately. He found the fountain of youth. The minutes are way up again, as I started to note a couple of weeks ago with the playoffs right around the corner, rotation tightening up. Paul Millsap starting to get more minutes, has top 30 fantasy points in 7 of his last 10 games. His play style pretends really well to cash games, so I definitely like him here. Jamal Murray absolutely torched the Celtics the last time these teams faced off. 48 real points, took 30 shots in that game. I don't expect that to happen again, but I would definitely have some exposure to guys like Murray, Harris, Monte Morris, and in some MME pools. Minutes for Monte Morris and Gary Harris are appealing at their price tags. On the Boston side of things, again, as I noted in the breakdown, with Gordon Hayward being out, that doesn't make everyone a significantly better play. His minutes are going to just kind of filter. You're going to get a couple more for Smart, a couple more for Rozier, a couple more for Brown, Morris, Tatum. All these guys are just going to pick up a couple extra minutes, and then you're going to get some Semi Ojeleye, maybe some Daniel Tice in there as well. So there's not going to be anyone that just massively benefits from Gordon Hayward being out in this spot, and it's not a matchup that I just absolutely love attacking. You can check out my notes for who I like from this game. There are a couple guys that I did highlight in there that I do think we can look at here, but I'm going to move on to a very, very important game to talk about. The New York Knicks at Toronto Raptors. Toronto 13.5 point favorites in this game. 215 over under. This is a back-to-back, so that means Kawhi Leonard not likely to play in this game. I currently have Leonard projected out. I currently have Kyle Lowry projected out. Dennis Smith is questionable. Noah Vonleh is questionable. Serge Ibaka is serving the last game of his suspension, and Frank Ntilikina is questionable here as well. It's going to be very important to keep an eye on the news for the Knicks. I don't have a ton of interest in them anyways, but if Dennis Smith Jr. were to miss this game, then guys like Emmanuel Mudiay, Kadeem Allen would come into play. The minutes are going to be there for Mudiay, 30 plus in 3 straight games, coming off a really good game against the Lakers. It's not a terrible matchup here. The Raptors are 17th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards on the season. So he would be someone that I would at least consider. Same with Kadeem Allen, who has managed to put up some pretty good games, and he's cheap. Struggled against the Lakers, 17 minutes, 2 of 2 from the floor. Just got in foul trouble, but in these other games, the last 2 games without Dennis, or the last game without Dennis Smith against San Antonio, 28 minutes, 27 fantasy points. He's someone that I definitely would keep an eye on here. Did have success against Toronto the last time these teams faced off. So that's something to at least keep in mind. The one guy that I do have interest in here from New York is DeAndre Jordan. I don't expect his minutes to keep going the way they have, 35, 31, 33, but he's playing really well. The rebounding is up. The assist numbers are really good for DeAndre Jordan. It's not something that you normally would expect from him. We did see this last season out of him a little bit, where he started to broach triple-double territory a couple times, and that's something to definitely keep an eye on. We have seen the Raptors really struggle against the roll man, allowing 1.18 points per possession to the roll man, and that's pretty interesting for DeAndre Jordan, who's just really cheap. 5,800 on DraftKings, 6,600 over on FanDuel. He's $20 on Yahoo, 11.5 on Fantasy Draft. I like the price tag. I like the potential for him to have a big game here, and he's going to be someone that no one really wants to look at, because there's a lot of risk with taking these Knicks guys. On the other side of the ball, this is where things get interesting again. I'm currently projecting Kyle Lowry out. I'm currently projecting Kawhi Leonard out for this game as well, and we already have Serge Ibaka out, so that's going to open up a pile of minutes for Pascal Siakam, Marc Gasol, Fred VanVleet, Norman Powell, OG Anunoby, all of these guys. This is a great spot here to get some exposure against a really bad defense. As I put in Discord this morning, I would make sure right now, or I would make sure early on, to set a rule to have at least 1 and no more than 3 Raptors in your lineup. The only reason I'm stopping it at 3 and for tournaments is because if you start to go with 4, then you really need to run it back with Knicks, and well, you never really want to force Knicks into your lineup. So I think Pascal Siakam, obviously a smash play. We know he's a guy, just whenever Leonard is out, you just play Pascal Siakam. Dude drops like 60 fantasy points on the regular without Kawhi Leonard in the lineup. It's a great matchup. Knicks 20th in defensive efficiency to power forwards. Marc Gasol is averaging like 1.19 fantasy points per minute without Leonard and Ibaka on the floor. Again, 33 minutes out of Marc Gasol, 6,200 on DraftKings, 7K over on FanDuel. We know the Knicks are really bad against opposing centers, so it's not rocket science here. You know the guys that you're looking at. If Kyle Lowry does indeed miss this game, it's going to be VanVleet, it's going to be Siakam, it's going to be Gasol. Jeremy Lin on FanDuel is a good drop score option, so is OG Anunoby. Norman Powell, guys that you can look at for drop score options over on FanDuel. I don't think either of those guys, the Anunobys and the Norman Powells, are going to be guys that you want to target too heavily in tournaments. I just don't see the upside out of these guys. I know Powell had 40 fantasy points against the Lakers, but I don't see him taking 14 shots even with all these guys already ruled out, and you're most likely going to get like 26, 28 minutes out of him and maybe 20 fantasy points, given what he normally produces. So in cash, it's fine. In tournaments, I just don't see the upside there. So, and if Lowry does suit up, he is definitely someone that we want to get some exposure to as well. I'll post any updates on that stuff in Discord. Again, it's going to be something that we want to keep an eye on throughout the day. Moving on to Miami at OKC. Russell Westbrook suspended for this game, 214.5 over under. Justice Winslow is questionable. That's something that we definitely want to keep an eye on. For you narrative street truthers, we get the Dion Waiters revenge game. We get the Josh Richardson homecoming game. So there's that for you. I know Josh Richardson has really struggled lately, averaging 9.8 points over his past 4 games, but he's a guy that I have a lot of interest in cash and in tournaments at 5,900 on DraftKings, 6,100 over on FanDuel. Matchup is low-key pretty good here for him. He's going to play a boatload of minutes because of his defensive skill set going up against Schroeder and going up against Paul George. I absolutely love Josh Richardson here. I do like Justice Winslow in tournaments if he's able to suit up. He's been playing really well, averaging right around a fantasy point per minute over the last 30 days. The field goal attempts are there. The rest of it's coming together for him. It's a spot where I'm not terribly worried about the matchup for him. I do really like Dwayne Wade as well, coming off of two down games in his last 3, but 28 minutes against Charlotte. He's going to play a bunch of minutes. Miami needs to win these games, and he's just so cheap. I only currently have him projected for 22 minutes on a back-to-back, but the usage rate up closer to 30% off of the bench, 4,400. It's just way too cheap. 5,400 on DraftKings. Or on FanDuel. I like the price tag there, and he's a guy. Most nights he's going to get you mid to low, or mid to upper 20s, low 30s most nights as you just look through his game log for the entirety of the season. Not a whole lot of games under 20 fantasy points, so I do like the spot here for him. You can look at Kelly Olynyk, scored 21 points against the Thunder the last time. It's worth noting that OKC does struggle to defend power forwards. They're allowing them to shoot 40% from the floor, and they have a lot of opponents who shoot 36% from 3 over the last 10 games. Kelly Olynyk has at least 30 minutes in 6 of his last 10 games. Apparently, Miami is not going to try to save on their tax bill, and they're going to just pay Kelly Olynyk the $1 million bonus for eclipsing 1,700 minutes because he is getting really, really close to that mark. So I guess they're just gonna roll with it. Outside of that, you can check the notes for the rest of the guys that I did break down there. On the OKC side of things, obviously, you want to make sure that you have at least one of, if not both of, Dennis Schroeder and Paul George, and 100% of your lineups here tonight, because there's just going to be so much usage and so much volume going to both of these guys that you don't want to fade them even in a bad matchup. Westbrook off the floor this season, George 34% usage rate, 1.46 fantasy points per minute. Schroeder 1.15 fantasy points per minute, 32.2% usage rate. When you pair those two guys on the floor together, George 32.6% usage rate, 1.42 fantasy points per minute. Dennis Schroeder 29.2% usage rate, 1.07 fantasy points per minute. Again, not a great option for either one, but I would not be fading them. If you're building 150 lineups, as I mentioned, I would have both of these guys in some fashion in 100% of your lineups. You don't have to pair them together in 100%. But I would make sure that 100% of your lineups has at least one of Paul George or Dennis Schroeder in them. Price tag $9,700 for George is just too cheap. 11.2 on FanDuel is a little pricey. Schroeder $6K over on FanDuel. It's just a spot where you don't want to fade either of these guys. You can look at Jeremy Grant in cash as a value. Has really struggled with his shot over the last couple of games, but the production is still there for him, and it is a pretty good matchup against Miami, who does struggle against power forwards this season. Golden State, San Antonio. As I mentioned, this is a pretty appealing game. We definitely want to keep an eye on the news. Durant is questionable. Cousins is questionable. Steve Kerr has mentioned resting some of these guys throughout this week. I think they have a pretty heavy schedule this week, which is why I would expect DeMarcus Cousins to sit this game out. He is going for an MRI today on that foot. That kind of tells me he's probably not going to play tonight, but that is something that we definitely need to keep an eye on throughout the day. I will cover in Discord who you want to look at if Cousins or Durant is out, but it's pretty straightforward. Kevon Looney is who you're probably going to want, especially at just 3,600 if DeMarcus Cousins is out. We know he's a guy going to play mid to upper 20s and produces pretty well when given the minutes. Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant, guys that do draw really good matchups. I dug into those matchups in the breakdown, so make sure you check that out. Klay Thompson, someone to also consider. On the San Antonio side, again, I don't really feel like we need to cover this game too in depth because I did it really well in the breakdown. I do have interest in Jakob Poeltl as a value option here. He's just playing really, really well, at least 5 blocks in back-to-back games. He's still cheap, 4,700 on DraftKings, 5,300 over on FanDuel. Going to get 25, 27, 28 minutes most nights. And he's been producing really well. More of a cash game option, but this is a matchup that he's had success in limited minutes, and this season and then last season as well had some success in this matchup. So someone to keep an eye on. Aldridge, DeMar DeRozan, I did dig into their micro matchups a little bit in the breakdown, so make sure you're checking that out. But onto a very, very appealing game, and one that we definitely want to make sure that we have exposure to. Again, as I outlined in Discord, I would make sure to have at least one player from this game. New Orleans and Dallas. Dallas 4.5-point favorites at 230.5 over under. Elfrid Payton, 4 straight triple doubles, going for number 5, and he gets a great matchup going for that 5th triple double. This is a spot against the Dallas defense that does really struggle against opposing point guards. I absolutely love the spot here for him. Over the last 30 days, 1.16 fantasy points per minute, 40% assist percentage with Jrue Holiday off the floor. A really, really, really good spot here for Elfrid Payton. 7,500 on DraftKings, 9,300 on FanDuel. I'm honestly on DraftKings not afraid of that price tag. The minutes are going to be there. The production is going to be there. He's just doing such a good job of filling it up across the board. It's tough not to love him. I really like Frank Jackson here, 4,600 on DraftKings, 5,100 on FanDuel. Production has not really been there for him of late, and he's very, very scoring reliant. But we know he has the upside if he's hitting those shots, and against a Dallas team that, well, can't really defend anywhere on the courts, there's a decent chance he's going to be hitting those shots. Dallas really struggles against spot-up shooters, and Jackson spotting up on 27% of his possessions this season. He's just playing so many minutes, 34, 35, 36 minutes most nights. Dallas also really struggles to defend the rim, where Jackson is taking 39% of his shots. I really like Frank Jackson as a value option here. Kenrich Williams, an interesting value option. He's still not producing extremely well, but he's just another cheap way to get exposure to this game in a pretty positive matchup. The Darius Millers, guys like that, I'm not terribly interested in. And then Julius Randle, Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis is averaging like almost 2 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. That's just insane. He's going all out whenever he's out there on the floor. I think he's fine in tournaments. He does have 40+ fantasy point upside. And in a matchup like this, it definitely could happen. Julius Randle, as I noted prior to last game, Alvin Gentry did mention cutting back on Randle's minutes and giving Cheikh Diallo more minutes in crunch time. I don't know if that's a thing he's going to do all the time. I don't know if that was just a matter because it was a back-to-back and he played like 42 minutes the night before. But it is something to keep an eye on. I'm pulling up the game flow right now to see if Randle closed out that. Yeah, so Julius Randle was on pace for 27 minutes against Phoenix before the overtime. So if that is the case going forward, I would definitely consider looking at Cheikh Diallo as a value option here tonight. We know he's a guy that can produce in limited minutes, and at 3,900, it is a pretty positive match for him if he's going to get 24, 26 minutes against the Mavericks. I definitely have some interest in him as a value. I'll check out Gentry's pregame press conference and see if he mentions anything about minutes for Diallo and Randle going forward. But again, he did indicate that he wanted to give Diallo some crunch time minutes going forward, so we'll have to wait and see how that shakes out. On the Dallas side of things, Luka Doncic, 8,900 on DraftKings, 9,800 on FanDuel. He is a core option for me. He is someone that I am hitting that lock button on for my personal lineups, but I only play one. So there you go. Do with that what you will. 35.1% usage rate, 1.44 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. Fast-paced matchup against the Pelicans. I really don't need to say too much. Luka Doncic is going to go absolute beast mode in this spot. I absolutely love him. Again, he is a core option for me here tonight. Jalen Brunson has been really, really good. Price tag is way up, 6,100 across the industry, but he continues to put up really, really strong games. Just shy of fantasy point per minute over the last 30 days. Cash is fine. I think his price tag is limited by, or his price tag limits his GPP ceiling, but definitely someone that we can look at in cash. Dwight Powell, Maxi Kleber, some guys that we can look at as well. I broke down their matchups and why I like Kleber a little bit in the breakdown, so make sure you're checking that out. Looking at Chicago, Phoenix, I'm not going to say too much about Lauri Markkanen in this spot. I've already been banging the drum on the Lauri Markkanen struggles for, well, like the last 5 games now. The guys that I'm looking at mostly, Robin Lopez, Zach LaVine are the 2 guys that I have the most interest in from the Chicago side of things. Lopez in close games continues to play a boatload of minutes. Excellent matchup. I mean, he even played 28 minutes against the Kings, and they just got absolutely destroyed. He does have plenty of upside in this spot against a really, really bad rebounding, really, really bad defense in the Suns. I like him in cash. Price tag a little too high for me to consider him in tournaments. Zach LaVine is the guy that I have the most interest in. 31.5% usage rate, 1.20 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. He's 7,900 on DraftKings, 8,300 on FanDuel. We know that the Suns really, really bad against opposing shooting guards. 30th in defensive efficiency. They've given up 0.89 points per possession in the pick and roll. That's really, really bad. LaVine operating in the pick and roll on about 40.1% of his attempts this season. He's also taking a lot of his shots at the rim. 48% of his shots come at the rim. Phoenix really struggles to defend the rim. 64.1% shooting allowed at the rim. I like Zach LaVine at 7,900 on DraftKings, 8,300 over on FanDuel. Chris Dunn's not a terrible tournament option. Otto Porter, not a terrible tournament option. Lauri Markkanen, again, as I mentioned in the notes, can be looked at in tournaments, but the recent production is concerning. And outside of that, Kyle Lowry has been upgraded to questionable. Cool. So that changes things a little bit. But yeah, Indiana at Portland. CJ McCollum is out for this game. But on the, oh wow, I skipped over Phoenix. Devin Booker, 8,500 on DraftKings. Still cheap over on FanDuel as well. Well, cheap relative to Devin Booker, 9,800 over there. Obviously a very, very good matchup. The status of Tyler Johnson is going to be important to keep an eye on. If Johnson plays, he's a viable cash tournament option. 4,600 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel. We know the Bulls really, really bad against opposing point guards. 28th in defensive efficiency. Should play 30+ minutes, so he has potential. That being said, Devin Booker's been playing point with Tyler Johnson out. 1.32 fantasy points per minute, 36% usage rate with Johnson off the floor. The Bulls are terrible defending the pick and roll, 0.90 points per possession allowed. They're also really bad defending in isolation, 0.99 points per possession allowed. Booker, 12.5% of his possessions come in isolation, 36% of his possessions come in the pick and roll. This is a great spot here for Devin Booker. I do have concerns about Kelly Oubre, as I've outlined before. Chicago, the league's second best defense against opposing small forwards on the season. He's 6,500 on DraftKings. He's 6,900 over on FanDuel. He's been so good. 20.2 points per game, 2.1 steals per game since the All-Star break. The Bulls, really bad against spot-up shooters, 1.05 points per possession allowed to spot-up shooters this season. He's spotting up on 28% of his possessions, so I still think he can be used in cash in tournaments. And Josh Jackson, DeAndre Ayton, guys that we can keep an eye on. If Rashawn Holmes were to miss this game, Josh Jackson would come into play at 4,200. But on to Indiana at Portland. Teased this one already, but CJ McCollum out for this game. Portland 3.5 point favorites at 213.5 over under. On the Indiana side of things, Darren Collison and Bojan Bogdanovic, the 2 guys that I'm looking at most. Bojan Bogdanovic, 28% usage rate over the last 30 days. Portland, 29th in defensive efficiency to small forwards. They've allowed a 46% shooting split, or 40. They've allowed 45.5% shooting, 39% shooting from three. This is a spot Bojan Bogdanovic, who's gonna take like 15 plus shots. Really love Bojan Bogdanovic. 5,900 on DraftKings, 6,400 over on FanDuel. Portland has been shredded in the pick and roll, 0.92 points per possession allowed. Pretty big boost to Darren Collison, who has top 30 fantasy points in 6 of his last 10 games, operating in the pick and roll on 35% of his possessions. He rarely has monster upside, but averaging 1.06 fantasy points per minute over the last 30 days. Something to keep an eye on. I did dig into Thaddeus Young, Miles Turner, and Wesley Matthews a little bit in the notes, so make sure you're checking that out. And on the Portland side of things, obviously the matchup sucks for Damian Lillard, Yusuf Nurkic, but with CJ McCollum off the floor, Damian Lillard 40% usage rate, 1.59 fantasy points per minute this season. Yusuf Nurkic 35.3% usage rate, 1.4 fantasy points per minute this season. Names, price tags that are really tough to overlook. 7,100 on DraftKings for Nurkic, 9K for Lillard, 8,900 on FanDuel for Nurkic, 10K over on FanDuel. Again, matchup is terrible, but the usage and production, really tough to overlook. You're probably looking at Rodney Hood sliding into the starting lineup. He's never an attractive name. 3,700 on DraftKings, 4,100 on FanDuel. Not a bad MME option, but it's Rodney Hood, so do with that what you will. Good luck in all your contests tonight, and I will be back tomorrow. I think we have a 6-game slate for Tuesday, so see you guys then.